Most people recognize this moment immediately. A conversation ends, and everything seems ordinary at first. The words have already been spoken, the discussion has moved on, and the situation appears finished. But sometime later, something unexpected happens. Perhaps it occurs while walking, driving, or lying in bed at night. Suddenly the brain produces a sentence. It is clear, precise, and perfectly structured. It is exactly what should have been said earlier in the conversation. The mind immediately recognizes the difference. During the actual moment, the response never appeared. But now, long after the discussion has ended, the perfect reply seems obvious. This experience is surprisingly common. Psychologists have studied this pattern for many years because it reveals something important about how the brain processes social interaction. The delay does not happen because the mind lacks intelligence or understanding. Instead, it happens because the brain often continues analyzing conversations long after they have already finished. Conversations move quickly. During a discussion, the brain must perform several tasks at the same time. It listens to words, interprets tone of voice, reads facial expressions, and prepares responses almost instantly. All of these processes compete for attention. While one part of the mind is focusing on understanding what another person is saying, another part is already attempting to construct a reply. This rapid exchange creates a kind of cognitive pressure. The brain must decide what to say before it has fully analyzed every detail of the situation. As a result, responses during real conversations are often incomplete. The mind chooses a sentence that feels acceptable in the moment rather than one that perfectly expresses the underlying thought. Later, when the conversation is no longer active, the brain finally has enough time to examine the interaction more carefully. Only then does the clearer response begin to form. This delay reveals something important about how human thinking operates. Many mental processes continue working even after a person stops consciously focusing on them. Psychologists sometimes describe this as background processing. After a conversation ends, the brain may still be reviewing the interaction. It compares what was said with what could have been said. It evaluates tone, meaning, and possible interpretations of the discussion. Because the mind is no longer under the time pressure of the conversation, this analysis can become more detailed. Ideas that were only partially formed earlier now have the opportunity to develop fully. The brain reorganizes thoughts, adjusts wording, and tests different explanations. Eventually, a sentence appears that expresses the idea clearly. When the mind suddenly produces the perfect comeback later, it is often the result of this delayed processing. The brain has simply finished analyzing the conversation. Another factor influencing this delay is emotional attention. During real conversations, emotions can affect how quickly the brain organizes ideas. If a comment feels surprising, frustrating, or confusing, part of the mind becomes focused on interpreting that emotional reaction. While attention shifts toward the emotional meaning of the moment, fewer mental resources remain available for constructing a response. This can slow the process of organizing thoughts into words. The brain may understand the situation internally but struggle to translate that understanding into a clear sentence in the moment. Once the conversation ends, the emotional intensity usually decreases. With less pressure from the situation, the brain can return to the interaction and examine it more calmly. Only then does the mind begin arranging ideas in a way that produces a stronger and more precise reply. Another important factor behind delayed comebacks is how the brain separates understanding from expression. In many conversations, a person may understand the meaning of a statement immediately. The mind recognizes the point being made, the implication behind it, or the flaw in the argument. However, understanding something internally is not the same as translating that understanding into language. To respond clearly, the brain must organize ideas into a sequence of words that others can easily follow. This requires the cooperation of several mental systems at once. Memory must retrieve the relevant information, language centers must structure the sentence, and attention must keep track of the conversation's direction. During a fast discussion, these processes often occur under time pressure. The brain may sense the correct idea, but struggle to assemble it into a complete explanation before the conversation moves forward. Later, when the situation has ended, the mind finally has time to complete that translation from thought into language. Social environments also influence how quickly the brain produces responses. Conversations rarely occur in isolation. They often involve other people observing, reacting, or waiting for their turn to speak. This creates subtle pressure with interaction. Even when a discussion remains calm, the presence of others can affect how attention is distributed. Part of the mind becomes focused on maintaining social balance. It monitors tone, politeness, and the rhythm of the exchange. Because these social signals require attention, they reduce the amount of mental energy available for building complex responses. The brain may choose a shorter reply simply to keep the conversation moving smoothly. Only after the interaction ends does that social pressure disappear. Without the need to manage timing, tone, and group reactions, the mind can devote more attention to analyzing the discussion itself. This shift often allows a clearer response to emerge later. Memory also plays a role in why better responses appear after the conversation has finished. During a discussion, the brain is continuously storing pieces of information about what was said. Certain phrases, arguments, or details may not seem important at first. However, after the interaction ends, the mind begins connecting those details together. A sentence spoken earlier in the conversation may suddenly take on new meaning when viewed in the larger context of the discussion. The brain compares different parts of the interaction and searches for patterns. This process can reveal connections that were not immediately obvious during the conversation itself. Once these connections become clearer, the mind may generate a stronger response that addresses the discussion more precisely. The delayed comeback is often the result of this deeper pattern recognition happening after the moment has already passed. Timing is another important element. Conversations unfold quickly, but thinking often develops at a slower pace. While listening, the brain must process incoming information while simultaneously preparing a reply. This overlap leaves very little time for careful reflection. When the conversation ends, the brain is no longer dividing attention between listening and speaking. Instead, it can focus entirely on reviewing what happened. In this quieter mental environment, thoughts begin to reorganize themselves. Ideas that were previously scattered across several impressions start forming a clearer structure. The mind arranges them into sentences that feel more direct and logical. Because this process occurs without interruption, the resulting response often sounds more complete. The delay between the conversation and the improved comeback simply reflects the time the brain needed to organize its thoughts fully. Another reason delayed comebacks appear later is related to how the brain processes information in stages. During a conversation, the first stage of thinking focuses mainly on understanding what another person is saying. The brain quickly interprets the words, identifies the main idea, and decides whether the comment is important. Only after this first stage is complete can the mind begin forming a deeper response. However, conversations rarely pause long enough for this second stage to fully develop. The discussion moves forward while the brain is still analyzing what was said. As a result, the response that appears during the moment may only reflect the earliest part of the brain's thinking. Later, when the mind continues processing the interaction, the deeper stage of analysis begins to unfold. New connections appear, alternative explanations form, and a clearer perspective develops. When the perfect comeback finally arrives, it often represents the second stage of thinking that simply needed more time to emerge. Language itself also contributes to this delay. Thoughts inside the mind are often more flexible than the words used to express them. Ideas can exist in a vague or abstract form before they become structured sentences. During a conversation, the brain must quickly convert these internal impressions into clear language. This translation process takes time. If the idea has not yet formed into a precise sentence, the response may feel incomplete or slightly unfocused. The mind might sense that a stronger explanation exists somewhere beneath the surface, but it cannot yet translate it into words quickly enough. Later, when the brain revisits the conversation, it continues shaping the idea. Gradually, the abstract thought becomes organized into language. Once that process is finished, the sentence appears clearly in the mind, often sounding exactly like the response that should have been spoken earlier. Attention also plays a significant role in how responses develop. In real conversations, attention is divided across many signals at once. The brain tracks facial expressions, body language, tone of voice, and the surrounding environment. These signals help people understand the emotional meaning behind words. However, monitoring all of these details uses mental resources. When attention is spread across multiple signals, fewer resources remain available for constructing a detailed reply. The mind prioritizes understanding the situation rather than refining the perfect response. After the conversation ends, many of these signals disappear. There is no longer a need to watch expressions or interpret tone. With fewer distractions competing for attention, the brain can concentrate on organizing the ideas that were already forming earlier. This shift in attention often allows a clearer response to appear after the interaction is already finished. Another interesting detail is how quickly the mind recognizes the delayed comeback once it appears. When the brain finally organizes the thought clearly, the sentence often feels immediately convincing. It sounds smoother and more logical than the words spoken during the conversation. This creates the strong impression that the mind has suddenly discovered the perfect response. In reality, the idea was likely forming during the interaction all along. The brain simply did not have enough time to complete the process. Once the conversation ends, the remaining pieces of the thought gradually come together. The sentence emerges as the final step of a longer analysis that has been unfolding quietly in the background. What feels like a sudden realization is often the moment when the brain finishes organizing the thought into a clear and complete expression. Another element involved in delayed comebacks is the brain's habit of reviewing social interactions after they end. Once a conversation is over, the mind often begins quietly replaying parts of it. Certain phrases, reactions, or moments may return to attention. This replay is not always deliberate. Instead, the brain automatically revisits interactions that carried meaning, disagreement, or uncertainty. During this review, the mind observes the conversation from a slightly different perspective than it had during the original moment. Without the pressure of responding immediately, the brain can examine the structure of the discussion more carefully. It notices where explanations became unclear or where an argument might have shifted direction. As this review continues, the mind gradually reorganizes the conversation. New interpretations appear, and ideas that were incomplete earlier begin forming clearer shapes. Out of this process, a stronger response may finally emerge, even though the conversation itself has already ended. Another reason the perfect comeback appears later is that the brain naturally prefers clarity. When people speak during conversations, their thoughts are often only partially organized. Words may be chosen quickly, and explanations can feel rushed or unfinished. After the interaction ends, the brain continues refining the ideas involved. It adjusts the wording, removes unnecessary details, and rearranges the structure of the explanation. This process resembles editing. The mind gradually shapes the original thought into a cleaner and more precise sentence. Because this refinement happens without interruption, the final version of the response often sounds stronger than anything said during the conversation itself. The delay between the conversation and the improved comeback is simply the time required for the brain to refine its language. By the time the sentence appears clearly, the interaction that inspired it has already passed. Social expectations also influence how responses appear during conversations. In many situations, people aim to keep discussions balanced and cooperative. Even when disagreements occur, the brain often tries to avoid escalating tension unnecessarily. Because of this, the mind may soften or shorten certain responses during the moment. The brain evaluates whether a stronger reply might change the tone of the interaction. While considering these possibilities, the mind sometimes chooses a safer or more neutral sentence. Later, when the conversation is no longer active, that social caution disappears. The brain can now examine the discussion without worrying about how the words might affect the atmosphere of the moment. Freed from those immediate concerns, the mind allows a more direct response to form. This difference between social caution and later reflection can make the delayed comeback sound far more confident. There is also an interesting relationship between time and perspective. During conversations, attention is focused narrowly on the present exchange. The brain concentrates on the immediate sentence being spoken and the response that must follow. Once the interaction ends, that narrow focus expands. The mind begins connecting the conversation to other experiences, memories, and ideas. A comment made during the discussion may remind the brain of another example or argument that would have been relevant. These broader connections often appear only after the moment has passed. As the brain links the conversation to additional information, the response becomes more complete. What began as a simple disagreement now appears within a wider context. The delayed comeback often reflects this expanded perspective, which only became available after the conversation had already ended. Another feature of delayed comebacks is the way the brain gradually organizes meaning after an interaction. During the conversation itself, the mind often processes information in fragments. A sentence is heard, a reaction is interpreted, and attention moves quickly to the next part of the discussion. Because this happens rapidly, the deeper meaning of certain statements may not be fully understood in the moment. After the conversation ends, the brain continues examining those fragments. It compares what was said with the broader context of the discussion and begins arranging the pieces into a clearer structure. Ideas that once seemed scattered now connect more easily. A comment that felt confusing earlier may suddenly appear straightforward when viewed alongside the rest of the interaction. Once the brain reorganizes the conversation in this way, a more precise response may finally become obvious. The delayed comeback is often the result of the mind finishing this process of organizing meaning. The brain's ability to imagine alternative conversations also contributes to this experience. Once the real interaction has ended, the mind may begin constructing small variations of the discussion. In these imagined versions, the conversation continues for another moment or two. The brain experiments with different responses, observing how the exchange might unfold if a different sentence had been spoken. These simulations happen quickly and quietly. Each variation allows the mind to test how clearly an idea could have been expressed. Through this process, the brain gradually discovers wording that feels more precise or persuasive. Eventually, one version of the response stands out as particularly clear. When that sentence appears in the mind later, it often feels like the perfect comeback. In reality, it is simply the result of the brain testing several possibilities within these imagined versions of the conversation. Another reason the mind continues working on conversations is the importance of social communication in human life. People rely on language to explain ideas, negotiate differences, and maintain relationships with others. Because communication carries such significance, the brain devotes considerable effort to understanding how conversations unfold. When an interaction contains disagreement or misunderstanding, the mind may continue analyzing it afterward. The goal of this analysis is not necessarily to change the past conversation. Instead, the brain attempts to improve its understanding of how similar discussions might develop in the future. Each conversation becomes a source of information about how people interpret ideas and respond to arguments. The delayed comeback can be seen as one result of this learning process. By reorganizing the conversation and producing a clearer response later, the brain refines its ability to communicate. Interestingly, the response that appears later often feels unusually confident. Because the brain has already examined the conversation from several angles, the final sentence seems carefully constructed. It contains the explanation, wording, and tone that the mind believes would have communicated the idea most effectively. However, this confidence partly comes from the environment in which the sentence appears. The response emerges in a quiet moment where there is no interruption, disagreement, or immediate reaction from another person. Without these pressures, the mind can focus entirely on shaping the thought. The result is a sentence that feels polished and complete. In contrast, real conversations rarely allow this level of uninterrupted thinking. The difference between the calm environment of reflection and the fast pace of discussion helps explain why the delayed comeback can feel so satisfying. From a psychological perspective, delayed comebacks reveal how the brain continues processing experiences beyond the moment in which they occur. Thinking does not always end when an interaction finishes. The mind frequently revisits events that carried meaning, uncertainty, or disagreement. During this quiet review, the brain analyzes what happened and reorganizes the ideas involved. Conversations are especially likely to receive this attention because they involve multiple layers of interpretation. Words, tone, and intention must all be understood at once. If any part of the interaction remains unclear, the mind may continue examining it later. The improved response that appears afterward reflects the brain's effort to understand the conversation more fully. Rather than being a sudden insight, the comeback represents the final stage of a longer process of reflection. When viewed from a distance, the experience of thinking of the perfect comeback later becomes easier to understand. It is not simply a moment of frustration or regret. Instead, it reflects how the brain naturally analyzes social communication. Conversations occur quickly, often leaving little time for careful reflection. Once the interaction ends, the mind gains the freedom to examine the discussion in greater detail. Ideas are reorganized, language becomes clearer, and connections that were not visible earlier begin to appear. Out of this process, a stronger response may eventually form. By the time the sentence becomes clear, the conversation that inspired it has already passed. The delayed comeback is therefore less about what should have been said, and more about how the brain continues studying conversations long after they are over.